You will hear a number of different recordings, and you will have to answer questions on what you hear. There will be time for you to read the instructions and questions, and you will have a chance to check your work. All the recordings will be played once only. The test is in 4 parts. Write all your answers in the listening question booklet. At the end of the test, you will be given 10 minutes to transfer your answers to an answer sheet. Now turn to Part 1 on page 2 of your question booklet. Part 1. You will hear a young man at a job fair talking to a woman who works for a food company as a professional chocolate taster. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 7. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 7.
Hello. I was wondering if I could get some information from you about the jobs going at the food company you work for.
Of course. Did you have a particular job in mind?
I see you're advertising for a professional chocolate taster. What's that exactly?
Well, I'm a professional chocolate taster, and the first thing you should know is that we don't just eat chocolates, we taste them. And that can mean trying up to 30 different types of chocolate in a day. The starting hourly salary is £10.25, but that increases to around £12.50 or more once you've got some experience under your belt. There are both full-time and part-time positions available.
Right. Is the work done in a lab?
Actually, most of the time you'll be sitting by yourself in a small room, and instead of the light in the room being white, it's often red. That's to disguise the appearance of the chocolate, so the taster isn't influenced by it.
Right.
And the work takes a lot of concentration. That's why there are a few rules. For example, you have to leave your phone in a locker because you need to avoid getting distracted. Otherwise, it's so easy to make a mistake.
Fair enough. So what actually affects the taste of chocolate?
Oh, there are many things that can have an effect on the taste. One of the most important things is the weather of the region where the plant grows. For example, if it is very wet or very dry, that'll change the taste.
Interesting. Is that the only thing?
No. When the cacao beans are ripe, the first thing that growers have to do before they can be sold is to spend time drying them. This can be done by leaving them in the sun, but also over a fire, and that affects the taste.
Right.
And then there's what happens in the factory. That has an impact too. The amount of time used for mixing the chocolate can vary, and that can have a noticeable effect on the flavour.
I see. Interesting. And I suppose the other thing that's very important is the amount of sugar that's added to the chocolate.
That's right, exactly.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 8 to 13. Now listen and answer questions 8 to 13.
I'm curious, could you talk me through how a professional chocolate taster goes about tasting chocolate?
I'd be happy to. The first step is to close your eyes and take a deep breath in so that you can appreciate the smell.
So each chocolate is different like that?
Yes, though if you just pop it straight into your mouth, you're unlikely to notice it. Another thing you want to check is whether it's been stored properly and to get an indication of its age. Any ideas? How do you think we'd check that?
I'm not sure. Do you break the chocolate by any chance?
Yes, quite right, with your fingers. It should sound crisp if it's good. And then you're ready to actually taste the chocolate. You should leave it on your tongue for as long as it takes to start noticing the flavours, and write down your thoughts as you do so.
Is it very difficult to taste all of the different flavours?
Yes, it's important for air to move around your mouth to taste all the flavours. And though some flavours are easier to pick out, like sweet and salty for example, it takes some time to notice anything with a bitter taste.
OK. It sounds like a fascinating job and one I'd really like to apply for. So what kind of person is the company hoping to employ? I'm not sure if it'll be useful, but the degree I'm studying for at the moment is in chemistry.
That's definitely one of the fields that we look for specialism in, though it's not always necessary to have been to university. Work experience is useful too. One of our employees was previously a chef, for example, so there isn't just one type of person that the company wants.
OK, that's good to know. Anything else?
Well, let's see. Your written skills need to be excellent, and there's a whole specialist vocabulary that we use to describe the types of chocolate that we make. You'd need to learn that on the job.
OK, that shouldn't be a problem.
And then another thing I should mention is, you should definitely take a lot of...
That is the end of Part 1. You now have 1 minute to check your answers to Part 1. Part 2. You will hear a manager at a country park talking to a group of new volunteers about the park and what they will be doing there. First, you have some time to look at questions 14 to 20. Now listen carefully and answer questions 14 to 20.
Hello, I'm Louise, a staff manager here at Marwood Park. I'll tell you all you need to know about the park, how it's run, and what's expected of you as volunteers here. Here are a few facts about Marwood Park. Something that many people don't realise is that Marwood Park is one of the biggest parks in the UK, covering an area of over 5,000 square kilometres. But most people are aware that the park includes the highest point in the county, which means you can see the surrounding countryside for miles around. And recently, we've begun to introduce a variety of animals to this habitat. As volunteers, you can use all the park facilities, including the cafe. However, you may find the cafe can get quite busy. It just depends on the day. Unfortunately, the staff discount on food isn't available to you as volunteers. So, if you prefer to bring food, that's fine. And of course, you're welcome to use the picnic area. You won't be asked to do any food preparation, but we might ask you to help with clearing the tables when we're very busy. One job you'll definitely do is welcoming visitors at the park entrance. We see lots of families with young children, and they all get a small pack containing pencils and games to complete in the park. You'll hand these out to any parents once they've got a sticker from staff to show they've paid. If you're asked about walking trails, you can tell visitors that maps are available for a small charge from the visitor centre. The park's popular with local schools, who often send groups for educational visits. These are booked and fully paid for weeks in advance, and we always insist that a teacher comes to a briefing here in that time. On the group's arrival, you should check that all pupils, staff and parent helpers are given an information sheet to read about safety procedures. Then a leader will take over. We have several venues which groups can hire for different purposes. Our theatres are large rooms set out as a lecture hall with a screen and so on, and it's popular with local companies for training sessions and similar events. We also have a relaxed buffet restaurant available for bookings, which is particularly popular with family groups. Then there's our event field. This is ideal for public shows and performances. You may be asked to help at any of these. Volunteers can work in the car parks too. There's no need to check for tickets in cars, as payment's controlled by cameras. But make sure there's no cycling in the car parks, as it's dangerous. Bikes should be left behind the visitor centre, where there are bicycle racks that are free to use. You should direct coaches to car park A, while cars can use any of the other 3 car parks. Although in summer, when it gets crowded, we let them use the top field too. Before we move on, let me remind you that all volunteers need a park pass. As you've submitted a photo already, your passes should be ready this afternoon, so pick them up then. And if you haven't given us details of your medical history yet, please do that online when you get home.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26. Now listen and answer questions 21 to 26.
Now, some volunteers might want to help with our park activities. Our shelter building activity is very popular. It's for teenagers, and they're shown how to use natural materials to make a shelter that protects them from wind and rain. For this role, you need to be confident talking to teenagers and motivating them. We've got a day-long orienteering activity, which is about participants learning to find their way through the forest using a map and compass. Some of the paths are quite steep, and you'll cover a large distance in the day, so you'd need to be able to manage that. A favourite activity is the story of plants, where we show participants how we cultivate and care for the wide range of plants and trees at the park. In this post, you're required to load and unload gardening equipment onto and off of our vans, and it weighs quite a bit. You'll always be with another volunteer. If you like art, you might enjoy helping with the woodland art workshops. They're for adults who come to paint, draw or sculpt forest scenery. They're very relaxed, and you'd have to be happy to get on with things without supervision. Our forest tours are getting really popular. These are led by a qualified park ranger. However, the groups are big, so your role would be to help make sure everyone understands what's being said and answer any questions. The Sounds of the Park activity is for some of our youngest visitors. It encourages children to listen to sounds from nature and play instruments made from wood, so it helps if you're musical. You would be in charge of this yourself, so you'd need to be okay with that.
That is the end of Part 2. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers to Part 2. Part 3. You will hear two museum studies students called Mia and Ben discussing their visit to an exhibition about Ada Lovelace, a 19th century mathematician. First, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 32. Now listen carefully and answer questions 27 to 32.
So, Ben, for our project, we have to give a brief summary of what the exhibition was about. I suggest we say, this museum exhibition portrays the life and work of the 19th century mathematician called Ada Lovelace, who was a pioneer of computer science. It includes replicas of the calculating machines she helped develop.
That's very clear, Mia, yeah.
Right. Let's say why we chose this exhibition for our project.
Okay.
Well, there was another exhibition about famous mathematicians last year that we missed, and I thought at the time that it would be very interesting to move away from arts, which our tutors seem to favour.
Yeah, it was good to have the chance to see how museums attempt to make science accessible to a wider public.
Agreed. Especially this place, which is always so innovative in its approach.
Absolutely. I'd read a lot about how they try to make complex information interesting through things like interactive displays and videos.
Yes. Going round the exhibition, I learnt a lot that surprised me. Of course, I already knew Lovelace was far-sighted on a wide range of matters beyond mathematics.
Yeah, really ahead of her time.
But I didn't realise she was also a gifted musician.
She was, yes, but a lot of people combine those two skills, so it's not all that unusual. For me, the unexpected thing was how she made and maintained friendships outside the family.
I know. I'd imagined her as an isolated genius, but the exhibition showed how close she became to people from all walks of life, and how loyal and supportive she was to them.
Absolutely. And another thing was she had a fine practical sense. I was intrigued to learn she was really astute about getting funding, aware that innovative technology isn't just a question of pure science. You need to plan how to get hold of the money required to make it operational.
That was a side of her I hadn't any idea about either.
Now we need to summarize her major achievements. I don't think we should make a big thing about her being a woman in a man's world.
You can't underestimate how unusual it was for a woman to become a scientist at that time.
I think that belittles her achievements. For me, a big thing is the fact that there's this language, Ada, which is used in computer networks all over the world.
Oh, I don't know. We should think about what she actually did, especially her contribution to the analytical engine, the world's first calculating machine.
Yeah, that's important. And another thing to highlight is that she published equations for computer programs before any other mathematicians did.
You're right, that's key.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 33 to 39. Now listen and answer questions 33 to 39.
So, Mia, let's think about the different parts of the exhibition and what we should say about each one.
Well, the section on her early life was very detailed.
I really liked the visual elements, the paintings of her when she was a child and as a teenager.
I wasn't sure they were all necessary, and there was rather too much about Ada's famous family, which didn't add much to our understanding.
For me, that was actually the most interesting bit.
Oh, the display about contemporary inventions was really helpful. It gave a lot of context.
The stuff on electricity was excellent. I like that it was based on some newly discovered material. That's relatively rare in exhibitions like this.
Oh, I only looked at that very quickly. What did you think of the models of the two calculating engines?
The important thing was to get a general idea of how they worked, and I thought the diagrams and animations really helped with that.
They were really clear, yeah. And then there was that whole section about cotton looms used in the factories and how they were designed to create patterns automatically. Really, the first computer software.
I saw quite a few kids having a go on the working models, and they were really enjoying it.
Of course, but it wasn't just for youngsters. I had a go, though I must say I still couldn't work out how such complicated patterns were produced.
Really? I thought it was pretty straightforward.
I wasn't sure about the display about Lovelace's translations.
Her translations of the work of that Italian engineer. Yeah, I thought what they showed us was confusing. I couldn't tell which details came from the original work and which were Lovelace's additional ideas, because she sometimes expanded on what she was translating.
Oh, I thought that worked fine. The part about the later years of her life was quite sad, wasn't it?
Yeah, the fact that she fell into such awful debt. But I think it would have been good to have found out how that happened. There wasn't much about her difficulties.
They left out a lot about those. I had to go away and read about it for myself.
Me too. And what about the final section? Lovelace's legacy. It was really comprehensive, wasn't it?
It's great they left so much room for that so you could wander around and choose what to look at in detail.
Yeah, they obviously decided to assign a big space for the last section. A really good call.
That is the end of Part 3. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers to Part 3. Part 4. You will hear part of a lecture about the history of maps and map making. First, you have some time to look at questions 40 to 49. Now listen carefully and answer questions 40 to 49.
For thousands of years, maps have illustrated features in the landscape to help people get from one place to another. They're a snapshot in time, and so they provide a fascinating image of the past, both in terms of what was physically present on the ground, such as settlements and roads, and in terms of the philosophies of mapmakers, such as the belief that the world was flat. Map making, or cartography, to give it its formal name, is an ancient skill. The earliest maps that we know of were produced in Mesopotamia, in present-day Iraq, in 2300 BC. Maps were created on thin, flat pieces of clay and showed settlements such as cities, sources of water, something that was of course very important in such a hot region, and they also included fields, mainly ones that were cultivated. Ancient maps have been found in other parts of the world too. Some from North America were made of bones, with lines representing coastlines carved into them. These were probably carried in canoes as navigational aids. Polynesians made intricate structures of leaves and inserted shells and twigs into them. The shells represented neighboring islands, while the twigs showed the direction of sea currents as well as the direction of winds. Small versions of these structures were used on journeys between islands, and large ones to teach future navigators. In China, from around 240 BC, we know of maps being carved on plates. These were long-lasting as they were made of wood. By this time, the ancient Greeks knew that the earth was round, and this is shown in a map produced in Egypt by the Greek Ptolemy in around 150 AD. From about Ptolemy's time in the 2nd century AD until about the 15th century, there's a long gap in our knowledge about the development of maps. By this time, maps were precious objects, individually produced by hand, and available only to those with wealth and power. But in the middle of the century, maps became cheaper and more widely accessible when printing was transformed by the newly invented press. In 1507, the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller produced the first map of the world, or to be more precise, the part of it that was known to Europeans at the time. This was also the first to use the name America, and to show it not as part of Asia, which Europeans had assumed to be the case, but as a continent, which was another major step forward in the history of cartography. In the next few years, Waldseemüller continued making maps, and in 1513, what's believed to be the earliest atlas was published. Gerardus Mercator was a Belgian and the leading geographer.
That is the end of Part 4. You now have 1 minute to check your answers to Part 4. That is the end of the listening test. You now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers to the listening answer sheet.